Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be doing a best case scenario for the Democratic Party as it pertains to the Senate races in this fall's midterm election. So obviously we're going to do this within reason. Of course, I'm not going to fill in all of the toss-up states as blue states because realistically, even in a best case scenario for Democrats this fall, that would never happen. However, we will be going state by state and analyzing which would be the best reasonable outcome for the Democrats in that specific state. So of course, before we get into it, this is not going to be an official projection. So of course, for the people that skip at the end, this is not my actual prediction for what's going to happen in these Senate races. More so, it's just what I think is the best case scenario for the Democratic Party. So we're going to look at all of these states in just a second. But first, before we begin, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So anyway, let's get straight into it. We'll start off with the state of Nevada and make our way east across the country. There's a couple of states that are currently as toss-ups right now that we normally don't have as toss-ups, mainly Utah and Iowa. That doesn't necessarily mean they're toss-ups. That just means the rating might change a little bit more in the Democrats' favor. So starting off with the state of Nevada, Catherine Cortez Masto is in a bit of a tricky spot with her opponent, Adam Laxalt. She's currently down in the polling aggregate by 0.5%. If you look at the RCP average, she's down by nearly 2 percentage points. Now, one bright spot for her is that Republicans tend to be slightly overestimated in Nevada polling, and I think in a best case scenario, if Cortez Masto is able to start to gain sort of a lead in these polls, she probably would pull out a victory. Now, even if she's down by a point or so in this best case scenario for Democrats, the momentum is on their side and they narrowly win this seat by about 2 to 3 percentage points. So I think that's probably the Democrats' ceiling in the state of Nevada. Again, as I've said in my previous video, I don't think Catherine Cortez Masto is the best incumbent for Democrats. She doesn't have nearly the enthusiasm, money, or backing that Mark Kelly and Raphael Warnock have. But I think in this best case scenario, the national environment going a lot more favorable for the Democrats is going to help her out in Nevada. Moving on over to the state of Utah. Now, this is a state that I normally have as safe Republican. In a best case scenario for Democrats, it actually wouldn't be a Democrat that does better in the state. It would be independent Evan McConnell, who has been endorsed by the Utah Democratic Party. They opted not to run a Democratic candidate for this seat. And as a result, in this scenario, Evan McConnell does about where his polling has him at, which is about down by single digits in the state of Utah. And again, this is of course a stretch, especially because Utah is such a Republican state, but Utah is a very unique Republican state in that they tend to like more moderate to even liberal Republicans on the statewide level and even for federal offices. And, Mitt Romney is an example of that. Spencer Cox, the governor, is an example of that. They're much more moderate Republicans than the national brand. And as a result, I think that in this best case scenario, a lot of those moderate Republicans, instead of voting for somebody like Mike Lee, who has aligned himself very closely with President Trump, especially after the 2020 election, they would opt to vote for Evan McConnell, who is a neoconservative candidate. He's somebody that does agree with Republicans on some issues, although he walked back his support for the pro-life movement after Roe v. Wade was overturned in an effort to win more Democratic support. But in a best case scenario, I think he probably loses by about 10 points or so. Realistically, Evan McConnell would not win this seat, especially since the primary elections. He has tacked a bit more to the left in order to appeal to Democrats and to try to get disaffected Republicans and independents to join his campaign. And of course, the national environment would help him in that situation. But again, Nevada is still a very Republican state, even despite the fact that Mike Lee is not necessarily the Republican that Utah tends to really like. But nonetheless, he would still end up winning by about 10 points or so in a best case scenario for the Democrats. Moving on down to the state of Arizona, this is a state that in reality really is a toss-up. And I think obviously in a best case scenario, you would have somebody like Mark Kelly hold on to this seat. Donald Trump lost this state in 2020 by 0.3%, but Mark Kelly won the state by 2.4%. So hypothetically, if Donald Trump had done just, a little bit better on the presidential level, you could have seen a split verdict in Arizona with Donald Trump narrowly carrying the state of Arizona and Mark Kelly still winning by about around 2 points or so. So in this situation, Mark Kelly probably beats Blake Masters pretty comfortably. Again, he probably doesn't win by a whole lot just because it's Arizona, but in the best case scenario for the Democrats, Blake Masters is underfunded. Mark Kelly hammers home these ads, paints Blake Masters as an extremist, and ultimately he gets about a 4-point margin of victory in the state. Again, this is still taking into account Biden's approval rating and the fundamentals of midterm. So this would be a lower ceiling for the Democratic Party by default going into this. Moving on over to the state of Colorado, Michael Bennet is the incumbent Democratic senator here. This is a very, very Democratic state. In the best case scenario for Democrats, I think Michael Bennet does a bit better than his polling would have you believe. He's up by about 9 points right now. In a best case scenario, I could see him maybe winning by 12, which again, I think would be a bit of a stretch, especially since Joe O'Dea, I think, is a uniquely good candidate for Colorado. I think realistically, in our timeline or in our scenario, I think he probably loses within mid to high single digits. But of course, in this situation, he loses by about 12 percentage points to Michael Bennet. Moving on over to Iowa. This is a tough one. Best case scenario for Democrats in Iowa is very tricky because the Democratic opponent to Chuck Grassley, I think, has been accused of sexual assault and misconduct. And, even in a best case scenario for Democrats, that's going to weigh him down to a degree. So Chuck Grassley's currently up by about 7 points in the polling average. We don't have a whole lot of polls out of Iowa. I think a best case scenario for Democrats would have Chuck Grassley probably winning by about 10 points or so. I really can't see him doing any worse than that. Chuck Grassley is really a political juggernaut in the state of Iowa. Even in our political polarized climate where you really don't see a lot of split ticket voting, as recently as 2016, Chuck Grassley, and again, 2016 there was more split ticket voting than there is now, but he defeated his Democratic opponent by over 25 percentage points. I think in 2022, even in a midterm year, I don't think he would lose that much momentum. Even if Chuck Grassley was up in 2018, I don't think he would win by less than 10. So ultimately, that's where I'm going to put this race as of right now. Moving on over to Wisconsin. Now, this is a tricky one because Wisconsin is a state that has a Republican incumbent. This best case scenario presumes that Democrats probably win the generic ballot by about a couple points or so, 2 to 3 points maybe, exceed expectations. Essentially, the momentum is in their favor. But Wisconsin is a very interesting state because as of late, Ron Johnson is polling ahead now. Early on in this race, he was polling below Mandela Barnes. I think realistically, Ron Johnson would probably hold on in a Democratic best case scenario. I think it's very unrealistic to see a situation where Ron Johnson loses at this point. I think in a best case, he would narrowly hold on to this seat by about 0.5 to 1%. Even if Democrats were doing really well this year. Moving on over to Ohio, this is an area where I think Democrats have the most potential in a best case scenario. Now, will it be enough for Tim Ryan to actually win this seat? Of course, that's very debatable. I think it's probably not. But Ohio, nonetheless, is still a state that has a Democratic labor past. And somebody like Tim Ryan is very optically tuning into that. He's, doing a lot of campaigning in northeastern Ohio, which is the area where his district once was. It's an area that has swung massively to the right from 2012 to 2016. And again, from 2016 to 2020, you saw a lot of these counties shifting 4 or 5 points to the right, despite the nation as a whole shifting to the left. And rural counties all over Ohio continue to shift more and more Republican, indicating that Republicans still have room to grow in the state of Ohio. Donald Trump won the state by 8.1%. So even in a best case scenario for Democrats, I think it's very hard to see a situation where Tim Ryan actually wins this race. Again, there is a lower ceiling for Democrats in this scenario just because Joe Biden is the president and he is unpopular. And Republicans are going to have a slightly better showing, even if Republicans lose the generic ballot by a couple of points. And while I think J.D. Vance is not really a good candidate for Ohio, polling does underestimate Republicans in Ohio. Even if Tim Ryan was up in the polls by about 1 to 2 points on election day in a hypothetical best case, I think the closest he would get is probably within 4 points, but that's about it. Ohio is still fundamentally a red state, and even if Democrats did fairly well in the generic ballot, I don't think a state like Ohio is flipping. Again, if you go to the 2020 results, Democrats won the popular vote by 4.5 points, and yet the state of Ohio voted over 8 percentage points for Donald Trump. So that really does put it into perspective. Moving on up to the Granite State, New Hampshire is an area where I think Democrats would probably really outperform in a best case scenario. Again, Maggie Hassan is up in the polling average by about 8 points according to RCP, 7.3% according to FiveThirtyEight. And while in our scenario, the momentum is expected to swing in favor of the Republicans, she's probably going to underperform these polls by a couple of points. I still expect Hassan to win by about 5 or so. But I think in this situation, she probably does at her polling or a bit better. And the state of New Hampshire goes likely Democrat. And again, New Hampshire was incredibly close back in the 2016 election. Donald Trump only lost the state by 0.3%. And yet in 2020, the state had one of the most starkest shifts to the left, with Donald Trump losing the state by over 7% just 4 years later. So a huge swing towards Joe Biden and the Democrats, a huge anti-incumbent swing. And New Hampshire really is a lean to even likely Democratic state on the national level. I say lean. It always gets sort of close in presidential contests and in federal contests to an extent, but it always does favor the Democrats. And obviously, if Democrats are doing better in this scenario, they're going to win New Hampshire pretty easily. Moving on down to the state of Pennsylvania, this is probably, again, one of the most important Senate races in the country. And if we take a look at the map so far, Democrats have 49 seats, Republicans have 47. But looking at Pennsylvania, this is an area where I think in a best case scenario for Democrats, they certainly would pick up this seat. Again, if we look at the polling now, John Fetterman is up by 4.1%. Now, historically, polling does underestimate Republicans in Pennsylvania. One of the reasons why I've consistently had Pennsylvania narrowly going to the Republicans on the Senate level. That and a number of other reasons I'll probably lay out in a separate video on the Pennsylvania Senate race more in depth. But looking at this race overall, it's not out of the question whatsoever that John Fetterman can win. And certainly in a best case scenario for Democrats, he would win. He's up in the polls now by about 4.1%. Hypothetically, in a best case scenario, he probably performs a little bit worse than his polls. I think a best case scenario for Fetterman is he probably wins by around 3 points or so. I don't think he's really the strongest candidate. Not that Oz is really the strongest candidate either. Both of them have a lot of baggage, but I think Fetterman has really been struggling as of late. But the national environment would carry him over the top. Josh Shapiro would probably win an even larger margin in the governor's race, and that would probably have coattails if it was especially lopsided. North Carolina is a state that always does get close, but always tends to lean towards the GOP at the end of the day. Of course, 2020, many political pundits had predicted that North Carolina would go to Joe Biden. It would flip Democratic, and ultimately it didn't. I was one of the few people saying that Donald Trump would win the state, and ultimately he did. He won it by 1.3, so there was a shift to the left by a couple of points. But this is a state that Democrats always put a lot of money in. They always invest a lot, and ultimately they always come up short. And I think in 2022, given the fact that currently in the polls so far, Ted Budd is up in the average, I think this seat would still stay Republican. Now, ultimately, I think in a best case scenario, Ted Budd probably only wins by about 2 points or so in a best case scenario for the Democrats. Again, polling in North Carolina always tends to underestimate Republicans. We've seen this in numerous past elections going back to 2014, where you had Kay Hagan up in the average, 2016 Hillary Clinton up, and 2020 Joe Biden up. So ultimately, I think Ted Budd would still win in this scenario, but it would not be an especially large win. Moving on down to the state of Georgia, if we take a look at Raphael Warnock's race against Herschel Walker, the polls so far have been neck and neck. We've had a period of time back in early September and late August where Herschel Walker was leading, then Warnock was leading, and now we have an area where essentially it's a statistical tie. And taking a look at the average so far, Warnock is up by 0.3% according to RCP. He's up by 2 points according to 538 overall. He's up by 1.3. Again, he did do fairly well in 2021. He outperformed Biden by nearly 2 percentage points. Overall, he won the state by 2 points. Biden only won it by 0.2, so an overperformance of about 1.8%. I think that certainly puts him in a very strong position, especially given the fact that in this scenario, the national environment would be favoring Democrats. They'd probably be winning the generic ballot by 2 to 3 percentage points. Raphael Warnock is also an incumbent. A lot of pundits also think that Herschel Walker is not exactly the strongest Republican nominee. And ultimately, in this scenario, Raphael Warnock would probably win by about 3 points or so. Georgia is an incredibly politically polarized state, so I don't really think you'd see a super lopsided victory, even if Raphael Warnock was especially popular. Especially given the fact that Georgia still is an ancestral Republican state. You still have Republicans winning down ballot, most likely, in this scenario. As they did in 2020, of course, they kept the legislative chambers. They won the popular vote in the House races. Going on down to the state of Florida, Marco Rubio is an incredibly strong candidate. He always outperforms in the state of Florida. He's really one of the big political juggernauts on the Republican side, really only akin to Chuck Grassley. He's not as much of a juggernaut as Chuck Grassley, but he's an incredibly strong candidate nonetheless. Currently, the polling average has him up by about 2.8 according to RCP. I think in our scenario and how the midterms will actually end up going, I think the polls are heavily underestimating Rubio, especially because in the average, you have a lot of these ridiculous polls that have Val Demings up by 4 points, Val Demings up by 2. I don't think it's realistic in our scenario that Val Demings is leading. But ultimately, I think a best case scenario for the Democratic Party is that these polls are slightly off. Again, Marco Rubio still wins this race, but he only wins by maybe about 5 or so. Again, even the most biased political predictions I've seen from the Democratic side don't have the state of Florida flipping. I don't think it's realistic either. I think Marco Rubio would still end up winning by about 5 points or so. DeSantis would probably win, by a similar margin. Both figures are very popular in a state that is trending more and more in favor of Republicans. Even in a year that I think would be tough for Republicans, I think they would still hold their own. Again, in 2018, Ron DeSantis and Rick Scott both won their races in Florida, despite it being a blue wave year. And that was one of the reasons why I thought Florida would go to the Republicans again in 2020, because I saw that as a trend, not just a one-off election. Because 2018 was a really good year for Democrats, but in Florida, not so much. So ultimately, this puts the Democrats at 51 seats. I really think that's their realistic ceiling at this point. Republicans at 49. 52 Senate seats for the Democrats, I think, isn't really that realistic, especially at this stage in the race, unless something really dramatic happens. But ultimately, this is my best case scenario for the Democrats in the Senate. I'll also do one for the governorships, and I'll do a coinciding set for the Republican Party as well. So anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. And as always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.